The night Lena was sold, the rain hit the glass skyscrapers like a cruel drumbeat, as if the entire city was watching her humiliation. She sat in the back seat of the black car, heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Her fingers twisted in her lap, nails digging half-moons into her trembling hands. She wore a dress they forced her into, something thin, low-cut, far too expensive for a girl who once wore hand-me-downs and patched-up jeans. The woman from the agency had shoved a tiny bag at her, lipstick, perfume, a single pair of heels, and hissed, "Remember, you smile, you play along, you get us our money." Lena had barely nodded before being pushed into the car, her throat dry, stomach in knots. She never imagined life could collapse so fast. Only 3 weeks ago, she was studying for her final exams at the small community college, juggling part-time jobs to pay for her mother's medicine. Then the phone call came. Her father's debts, long ignored, had come crashing down. And in one desperate, horrible deal, she was handed over to the escort agency to settle it. Not forever, they promised. Just one night, just one client, one night for the family. Her hands trembled harder when the car pulled up to the penthouse building. The driver, a stone-faced man in a suit, opened the door without a word. Lena's legs felt like jelly as she stepped out into the cold rain, the heels unsteady beneath her. The doorman didn't look at her face, only nodded and gestured to the private elevator. Her chest squeezed painfully as she rode up, watching the numbers flash. 34th floor, the top. The world of the untouchable rich. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sleek hallway of marble and gold. She stepped out, her breath shallow, her eyes wide. At the end of the hall, a man waited, leaning casually against the open door of the penthouse. Lena's mouth went dry. He was tall, sharply dressed in a black suit with no tie, dark hair slightly tousled, jawline cut like stone. But it was his eyes that froze her in place, cold, gray, and piercing like they saw right through her. "Come in," he said, voice smooth but distant. Lena forced her legs to move, stepping inside. The penthouse was breathtaking, glass walls overlooking the stormy skyline, polished floors, minimalist design, art pieces that probably cost more than her childhood home. She felt small, painfully out of place. The man didn't smile. He didn't offer a drink or flirt or leer. He simply watched her with a gaze sharp enough to draw blood. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Lena hesitated. "Lena," she whispered, her voice thin. He raised an eyebrow. "And how old are you, Lena?" She swallowed hard. 20. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing. Then he moved closer, slow, deliberate. Lena flinched when he reached out, but instead of touching her, he took off his own coat and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. "You're freezing," he murmured. She gaped at him, confused, her heart racing. What do you want me to do?" she stammered. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, not a smile, but something close. "Nothing," he said softly. "You're not here for what they told you." And with that, Ethan Black, the ruthless billionaire feared across Wall Street, turned away, his sharp profile lit by the city lights. Lena sank onto the edge of the sleek leather sofa, coat wrapped tightly around her, her mind spinning. She had been sold into a world she didn't understand, but this man, this cold, dangerous man, was about to turn her fate upside down. Lena sat stiffly on the leather sofa, her eyes darting nervously around the massive living room, everything gleaming under soft golden lights, glass walls framing the glittering city outside, polished floors reflecting the storm still raging beyond. Her fingers clenched tightly on the thick coat draped over her shoulders, its heavy fabric still warm from the man who had given it to her. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't what she was prepared for. Not that she had truly been prepared for anything. How could anyone prepare for being sold, for stepping into a stranger's home, for surrendering her body like a debt payment? She hated herself for shaking, for feeling small and lost. She hated the fear curling in her gut, but more than anything, she hated the way his presence filled the room, silent and powerful, making her heart race with something more complicated than just fear. Ethan Black stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the storm, sharp features hard to read as he looked out over the city, the stormlight catching in his dark hair, his hands tucked calmly into his pockets. He didn't seem to care that she was there, didn't even glance at her, but somehow Lena could feel his awareness of her, like an invisible string pulling between them. She knew his name, of course. Everyone knew Ethan Black, the billionaire financier, ruthless on Wall Street, untouchable in courtrooms, legendary in both business and scandal. He was the man people whispered about, feared, envied, and here she was, sitting in his home, wrapped in his coat, wondering why she wasn't already trembling under his hands, why he hadn't even touched her, why his icy voice still echoed in her mind. "You're not here for what they told you." Her mind flashed back to the agency, the cold-eyed woman who had handed her the tiny dress and heels, who had told her to act experienced and just survive the night. Lena had almost backed out, had almost run, but the memory of her mother's tear-streaked face, the bills piling on the kitchen table, her father's desperate phone calls, it had all pushed her forward. She had told herself she could endure anything, one night, just one. But now that she was here, facing a man who wasn't behaving like a client, her resolve crumbled into confusion. She shifted slightly on the sofa, the hem of her dress pulling higher on her thighs, and she quickly tugged at the coat, cheeks flushing. She caught Ethan's glance then, his eyes flicking briefly toward her, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his sharp features before he looked away again. Ethan felt the tension in the room like an electric pulse. The girl sitting on his sofa was too young, too raw, too obviously terrified. She didn't belong in this world, and yet here she was, trembling and clutching his coat like a lifeline. He had known the moment she stepped into the penthouse that something was wrong. He had expected a decoy, another calculated move from the crime network he had been tracking for months. But instead, he got her, a girl whose wide eyes betrayed innocence, whose voice cracked with fear, whose presence made something old and cold in his chest shift uncomfortably. He should have sent her away, called his security, told her to leave, but instead, he found himself still standing there, watching the rain streak down the glass, aware of every quiet breath she took behind him. Lena's eyes moved across the room, taking in the space, the minimalist design, the expensive art, the heavy bookshelves lining one wall, the sleek, open kitchen gleaming under soft lights. She felt out of place in every possible way, like a smudge on a pristine painting. And yet she couldn't leave, not yet. Her legs felt too weak, her heart too loud, her fingers too tightly clenched in the coat he had given her. She swallowed hard, gathering the little courage she had left. "Why am I here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to glance at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Because someone wanted you to be," he said quietly. "But not me." Lena's breath hitched, her confusion deepening. She gripped the coat tighter, her thoughts spinning. If he didn't want her for what they said, why keep her here? What game was this? And why did it scare her even more than if he had simply acted like a client? Across the room, Ethan took a slow breath, his mind calculating. He hadn't expected tonight to unfold like this. His plans were precise, every detail sharp, every move controlled, but this girl was an anomaly, an unexpected variable, and now that she was here, trembling and confused, he couldn't simply push her back out into the storm, not when he suspected the people who had delivered her were tied to the very network he was determined to crush. He watched her from the corner of his eye, saw the way she shivered, despite the warmth of his coat, saw the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks, saw the fragile hope and terror warring in her gaze, and he knew, with a heavy certainty, that she was a piece of this puzzle he couldn't afford to ignore, whether she realized it yet or not. The hours stretched painfully slow, Lena remained curled on the sofa, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The billionaire had left the room briefly, returning with a soft throw blanket which he draped over her shoulders without a word. The weight of it and the faint scent of his cologne made her heart pound faster. She had never been this close to such a powerful man, let alone alone in his penthouse. She wondered if she should run, if she could, but her legs refused to move. Her head throbbed with exhaustion. The fear, the humiliation, the confusing mix of tension and safety all swirled together inside her chest. She pressed her hands to her face, feeling the burn of tears. She hated herself for crying, hated the weakness spilling out when she needed to be strong, but she was only 20. She had no idea how to navigate this, no idea how to survive. And yet, even in her shame, part of her noticed the way Ethan moved, calm, silent, his sharp eyes flicking to her now and then with an expression she couldn't read, not lust, not anger, but something else entirely. Ethan sat down across the room, scrolling through documents on his tablet, his sharp jaw tense, his mind busy. But every few minutes his gaze drifted back to the girl curled on his sofa. She was so painfully out of place here, so clearly not one of the usual women the agency sent to men like him. Her shaking hands, the way she kept flinching at shadows, the way she looked like she wanted to disappear, it all gnawed at something deep inside him. He told himself to focus on the mission, the agency, the investigation, but his thoughts kept circling back to her. Who had sold her? Why had they chosen his name? And more importantly, what was he going to do with her now? Because letting her go back meant throwing her into the wolves' den again. But keeping her here, under his roof, in his world, that was dangerous in its own right, dangerous for her and for him. As midnight passed, Lena's head drooped, exhaustion pulling at her, the blanket slipping slightly. As she curled into the cushions, she vaguely sensed him watching, but her eyes were too heavy, her body too drained. She drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of cold hands, dark alleys, whispered threats, and then, strangely, the soft warmth of a coat, the scent of something expensive and unfamiliar. When she stirred again, she felt arms, strong and sure, lifting her carefully, cradling her as if she weighed nothing. Her heart jolted, but her eyes fluttered only half open. She caught a glimpse of a chiseled jaw, the shadow of stubble, the faint crease between his brows as he looked down at her. Then she was settled gently onto a bed, the blanket tucked around her. The sound of a deep sigh as the man stepped back. Lena wanted to ask why, wanted to speak, but the pull of sleep was too strong. She sank back into the pillows, her last thought a confused, aching question. Why was he being kind? Morning came too fast, sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows. Lena sat up slowly, the blanket slipping to her lap, her eyes wide as she took in the room. It was minimalist but luxurious, the bed large enough for 3 people, the furniture sleek and modern, the view breathtaking. She ran trembling hands through her tangled hair, struggling to remember how she had gotten here. Her cheeks burned as pieces returned. The billionaire, the sofa, the way he had lifted her, cradled her, tucked her in like she was something fragile. She bit her lip, unsure if she should feel grateful or terrified, when the door opened and Ethan appeared, dressed casually now. Dark shirt, tailored pants, sleeves pushed up, revealing strong forearms. His sharp eyes met hers, and for a long, charged moment, neither of them spoke. "You're awake," he said finally, voice low. Lena nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "I didn't mean to fall asleep here." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "You were exhausted," he said simply. "I wasn't going to throw you out into the storm." She bit her lip, her heart thudding. "I should go," she whispered, trying to rise, but he held up a hand, a subtle gesture that froze her. "Not yet," he said. "We need to talk." Confusion rippled through her. "About what?" she asked softly. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet away, his gaze sharp, assessing. "Who sold you?" he asked quietly. "Who arranged this?" Lena's breath caught, panic rising. I don't know," she stammered. My father. His debts. Her voice cracked, shame flooding her face. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, something flickering in his gray eyes. He exhaled slowly. I'm not the client they told you I'd be, he said softly. I don't want you like that. I want answers. Lena sank back onto the bed, hands shaking. She told him everything, the debts, the threats, the way they had cornered her, how she had been handed over like an object. Her voice trembled. But Ethan listened silent and still, his eyes darkening with every detail. When she finished, she felt hollow, exposed, but then he spoke, and his voice held something new, something fierce. You're not going back to them, he said firmly. Not while I'm standing. Lena blinked, confusion mixing with a strange warmth. Why do you care? She whispered. You don't even know me. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, his voice low and rough. Because no one should be sold. Lena's breath hitched, her heart pounding painfully. She didn't understand this man, didn't understand why he, of all people, was showing her this fierce, protective side, but part of her, the part that had been terrified and alone for so long, wanted desperately to believe him. The following days blurred into an uneasy rhythm. Lena remained in the penthouse, too scared to leave, too overwhelmed to process everything. Ethan worked long hours, but he always checked in on her, bringing food, asking careful questions, never pushing, never touching, but his presence filled the rooms, undeniable when they spoke. She found herself opening up, sharing small pieces of her past, her dreams, her regrets, and in return, he revealed flashes of his own history, his childhood, the losses he never talked about, the sister he had once loved and lost, the loneliness he wore like armor. Their connection deepened, slow and fragile, but real, and Lena began to realize that the man she had feared was far more complicated, far more wounded, and far more human than she had ever imagined. And what terrified her most was how much she wanted to reach for him, to touch the sharp edges of his heart, to see if they could soften under her hand. Lena sat curled on the wide windowsill of the penthouse, legs drawn up, arms hugging her knees. As she gazed out at the glittering skyline, the city pulsed with life below, but she felt like she existed in a world apart, wrapped in silence and shadows. Ethan had left early that morning, a brief word, a glance. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her tangled thoughts. It had been days since she first arrived, days of strange quiet, of stolen glances, of conversations that danced too close to things neither of them dared say aloud. Lena still remembered the fear she had felt that first night, the humiliation, the raw panic, but now she found herself caught in something she didn't understand, something far more dangerous. Her heart clenched as she thought of Ethan, the way his eyes softened when they spoke, the rare hint of warmth in his voice when he asked how she was. She told herself she was imagining it, projecting her need for comfort onto a man who had no reason to care. And yet, every time he stepped into the room, the air between them shifted, charged and trembling. And she hated, absolutely hated, how much she wanted to believe he saw her as more than just a pawn in his game. Ethan stood in his office, fingers drumming absently on the polished desk, eyes narrowed at the screen in front of him. His team had traced the agency that delivered Lena, and the trail led to something far uglier than he expected. A network of traffickers, debt collectors, and money launderers, all interconnected, all hiding behind layers of fake companies. His jaw tightened as he read the files, anger simmering beneath his cool exterior. He remembered Lena's trembling voice when she spoke of her father's debts, the way her eyes filled with unshed tears when she confessed she had no other choice. He hadn't planned to keep her here, hadn't planned to get involved, but the more he uncovered, the more he realized she was a victim in a web far larger than either of them, and somewhere deep down in the part of himself he usually kept locked away, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sharp, protective instinct, and it scared him because he knew, Once he let someone in, once he let someone matter, they became his weakness. That evening, Ethan returned to the penthouse, stepping inside quietly, his sharp eyes immediately finding Lena still perched by the window, the fading sunlight casting a soft glow around her. She turned when she heard him, a hesitant smile brushing her lips, and for a moment, Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully. She was beautiful, not in the polished, artificial way he was used to, but in a raw, unguarded way that hit him somewhere he didn't know how to defend. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to look away. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Lena nodded, sliding off the windowsill, wrapping her arms around herself as she followed him into the sitting area. They settled across from each other, the room heavy with unspoken tension. "I've been digging," Ethan began, his voice calm but edged with steel. "The people who sent you here, they're part of something bigger, something I've been working to expose for months." Lena's eyes widened, confusion and fear flickering across her face. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Ethan exhaled, slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "It means you were caught in a net designed to trap vulnerable girls like you, and it means they won't just let you walk away." Lena felt her heart lurch, panic rising. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "I don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "Why me? Why would they involve me?" Ethan's gaze softened slightly, a rare crack in his guarded expression. "Because they could," he said quietly. "Because they saw a girl desperate enough to do anything to save her family, and they thought you'd break easily. They didn't expect you'd end up here." Lena's breath hitched, her mind spinning. "What happens now?" she whispered. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Now," he said softly, "you stay here, where I can keep you safe, and you help me take them down." The days that followed blurred into a strange, intense routine. Ethan brought Lena into his world, carefully, gradually, teaching her how to read the documents his team uncovered, how to recognize names, patterns, clues. They worked late into the night, sometimes side by side, sometimes across the room, the air between them humming with something neither dared name. Lena found herself drawn to Ethan's sharp mind, his quiet intensity, the way his rare smiles made her heart stutter. She saw the loneliness he tried to hide, the weight of guilt he carried for a sister. He had lost to a world like this, and somewhere along the way, her fear began to shift, not disappearing, but softening into something more complicated, something that ached in her chest when she caught him staring at her when he thought she wasn't looking, something that made her stomach twist when their hands brushed over shared papers. She knew she was falling, and it terrified her. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Lena sat curled on the sofa, her head resting on her knees, watching Ethan pace the room, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with frustration. "They're moving faster than I thought," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "We need a breakthrough." Lena hesitated, then stood, crossing the room to where he stood by the window. She reached out, fingers brushing his arm. "You're not alone," she said softly. Ethan froze, his head turning slightly, his eyes meeting hers. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick between them. Then, slowly, Ethan reached up, his hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. His touch, gentle, almost reverent. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured, his voice rough. Lena's breath caught, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, to tell him she was scared, to tell him she wasn't sure she could do this. But the words tangled in her throat, and all she could do was stand there, trembling under his touch, wishing the moment could stretch forever. The night the storm truly broke, Lena knew something was wrong. The tension had been building for days. Ethan's calls became shorter, his temper sharper. The files they were uncovering pointed to darker truths, names and places Lena had never wanted to know. Yet she found herself tangled deeper and deeper, sitting late at night beside Ethan, reading over ledgers and coded messages, watching as the man who had once terrified her turned into something achingly human. She had seen him laugh softly at her jokes. She'd watched him fall asleep in his chair, exhaustion tugging at his sharp features, and she'd felt something raw and painful in her chest, something she dared not name. But tonight, everything shifted. She sensed it the moment Ethan walked into the penthouse, his shoulders tense, his eyes darker than usual, his voice low and cold as he told her to pack a bag. Panic gripped her chest. "What's happening?" she asked, but he only shook his head. "They know you're here," he said tightly. "We need to move now." The next hour passed in a blur. Lena stuffed a few clothes into a bag, hands shaking, while Ethan barked quiet commands into his phone, the penthouse filled with a strange, electric energy, the air heavy with urgency. Lena's heart raced painfully, her mind spinning with fear. She tried to keep calm, to trust Ethan, but when he reached for her hand, pulling her quickly toward the elevator, she felt the panic crest. "Where are we going?" she gasped, but Ethan only gave her a grim smile. "Somewhere they can't reach you." The elevator doors slid shut, carrying them down. Lena pressed against the wall, clutching her bag, trying to steady her breathing. She watched Ethan's profile, sharp and focused, the lines of his jaw tight with tension. She wondered if he was scared too, or if this was just another game to him. But when his hand brushed hers, she felt the slight tremble in his fingers, and she realized, with a jolt, that this was real. Terrifyingly real, and they were both in far over their heads. They emerged into the underground garage, a sleek car waiting. Ethan opened the door for her, guiding her in before sliding into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, and they shot out into the night, the city lights blurring past. Lena clutched the seatbelt, glancing nervously at Ethan. "Where are we going?" she whispered again. Ethan's mouth tightened. "Safe house," he muttered, "and place I trust." Lena bit her lip, her mind racing. "Why are they after me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel, his jaw clenched. "Because you're a witness now," he said quietly. "And they don't leave loose ends." Lena's stomach twisted painfully, tears stinging her eyes. She turned away, staring out the window, trying to hold herself together, trying not to let the fear swallow her whole. But when Ethan reached over, his hand briefly covering hers, his voice soft, "I won't let them touch you," she broke, a quiet sob slipping from her lips as she pressed her forehead to the cold glass. Hours later, they reached the safe house, a secluded estate outside the city, high walls, security gates, guards at every corner. Ethan led her inside, his hand firm on her lower back, guiding her through the darkened halls. Lena's legs felt weak, exhaustion dragging at her, but she kept moving, kept following him, trusting him even though every part of her screamed with doubt and fear. Finally, they reached a quiet room. Ethan opened the door, flicking on a soft lamp. "Stay here," he murmured. "Rest. I'll be downstairs." Lena hesitated, then nodded, stepping inside as the door closed softly behind her. She let out a shaky breath, sinking onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. She didn't know how long she sat there, trembling and lost, before the door opened again and Ethan slipped inside, his eyes shadowed, his voice rough. "We need to talk." Lena looked up, her heart lurching. "What is it?" she whispered. Ethan crossed the room, sinking into the chair across from her. For the first time since she met him, he looked tired, truly tired, the lines around his eyes deep, the tension in his shoulders unmasked. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, quietly. Lena's breath caught. "What?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "My sister," he began, his voice rough. "The one I told you about, the one who disappeared 10 years ago. She's not missing." Lena's stomach twisted, her hands clenched in her lap. "What do you mean?" she asked, barely breathing. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, sharp and pained. "She's alive," he said softly, "and she's the one running the network." The words hit Lena like a blow. She stared at him, shocked, her mind reeling. "No," she whispered. That's not possible. Ethan gave a harsh, bitter laugh, his eyes glinting. I thought the same, he said. I spent years searching, grieving, and all this time she was building an empire out of human lives, including yours. Lena felt her heart pound painfully, tears stinging her eyes. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice small. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. I have to stop her, he said quietly, even if it means destroying the last piece of family I have left. Lena reached out impulsively, her fingers brushing his. You're not alone, she whispered. Ethan's eyes softened slightly, his hand turning to clasp hers. Neither are you, he murmured, and in that moment, despite the storm swirling around them, Lena felt something fierce and fragile spark between them, something that terrified her, but also gave her hope. The night was heavy with tension as Lena lay awake in the darkened room. Every sound seemed amplified, every creak in the walls, every gust of wind outside. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as she replayed Ethan's words over and over. His sister, the one he had loved and lost, was the very person orchestrating the nightmare that had nearly swallowed Lena whole. She couldn't imagine the weight Ethan carried, the crushing realization that family, the only family he had left, was the enemy. Tears stung Lena's eyes as she curled tighter under the blanket. She wanted to comfort him, wanted to tell him he wasn't alone. But the words tangled in her throat because she knew deep down that this fight was bigger than either of them, and the road ahead would demand sacrifices they might not be ready to make. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the painful ache blooming there. She was falling for him, she realized, falling hard, and the fear of losing him now was almost worse than the fear of the men hunting her. Downstairs, Ethan sat alone in the study, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table, his hands steepled under his chin, eyes fixed on the dark window. His mind raced through strategies, alliances, risks, but no matter how he turned it, the truth remained a blade pressing against his throat. To dismantle the network, he would have to go through his sister, the girl he had once sworn to protect, the girl he had searched for through years of grief, the girl who now stood on the opposite side of everything he believed in. He exhaled shakily, closing his eyes, and for a brief moment, his thoughts drifted, not to his sister, not to the empire he had built, but to Lena, the girl upstairs, the girl who had stumbled into his life by accident and somehow cracked open the walls he had spent years fortifying. He remembered the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the quiet strength she showed even when terrified, the way she reached for him when she thought he was breaking, and a raw, unfamiliar fear tightened in his chest. He couldn't lose her, not now, not after everything. Hours later, as dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan stood in the doorway of Lena's room, watching her sleep. She was curled, on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, the blanket tangled around her, a faint frown creasing her brow even in rest. His throat tightened painfully as he stepped closer, his hand hovering over her shoulder before he let it drop. He wanted to touch her, to wake her, to tell her he would fix this, that she would be safe, but the words felt too heavy, too dangerous. Instead, he turned away, moving quietly through the house, his steps slow and deliberate. The next hours passed in a blur. Ethan met with his team, coordinated with law enforcement, gathered every piece of evidence they had. Every plan hinged on precision, timing, and nerves of steel. But as the final hours ticked by, Ethan found his focus slipping, his mind drifting back to Lena, to the curve of her smile, the softness of her voice, the fierce resilience in her gaze. He clenched his fists, shoving the thoughts away. He couldn't afford distractions, not now. When night fell again, the trap was set. Ethan stood at the edge of the safe house grounds, dressed in black, earpiece in place, voice low as he coordinated the final moves. His team moved like shadows through the dark, silent and lethal. Lena stood at the window upstairs, heart in her throat, watching the man who had become her anchor step into the lion's den. She wanted to run after him, to beg him not to go. But she knew better, knew this was something he had to face, and so she pressed her trembling hands to the glass, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone could hear. Time stretched painfully slow, every minute dragging, like an eternity, until finally, shots cracked in the distance. Muffled shouts echoed through the grounds. Lena's heart slammed painfully against her ribs. She pressed closer to the window, eyes wide and frantic. She thought she saw movement, a flash of black, and then everything went terrifyingly still. Moments later, the door burst open. Ethan stumbled inside, bleeding from a cut along his temple, his chest heaving, eyes wild. Lena cried out, rushing to him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "You're hurt," she gasped. Ethan caught her face in his hands, his grip fierce, his voice rough. "She's gone," he rasped. "She ran, we couldn't catch her." Lena's heart plummeted, but before she could speak, Ethan pulled her close, his forehead pressing against hers, his breath shaking. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, his voice raw. Lena's hands trembled as she clutched his arms, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I thought I lost you," she choked, and in that breathless, fragile moment, they clung to each other, two broken souls tangled in a storm. They couldn't escape, yet refusing to let go. Ethan's lips brushed her forehead, his hands trembling slightly as he held her. "Stay with me," he murmured, and Lena pressed closer, her heart breaking open. "Always," she whispered, the word a promise, a prayer, a fragile thread tying them together even as the world threatened days passed in a blur, as Lena sat quietly in the penthouse, watching the world outside shift and move, while inside she clung to the delicate thread of safety Ethan had created around them. The weight of everything they had survived pressed down on her shoulders, the memories of those terrifying nights, the tension of being hunted, the heartbreaking realization that Ethan had nearly lost his only family to the darkness they were fighting. All of it swirled inside her chest, but at the center of it was something stronger, something she hadn't expected. Love, raw and fierce, the kind that wrapped around her like a shield. It was in the way Ethan looked at her now, softer, no longer guarded, no longer sharp-edged and cold. It was in the way he reached for her hand without thinking. The way his voice softened when he called her name, the way he touched her hair when he thought she was asleep. Lena felt it every time their eyes met, every time his fingers brushed hers, every time she caught him timing her across the room, with an expression that made her heart ache. She never thought she would find this, not in the wreckage of everything she had lost, but here it was, fragile, imperfect, real. One quiet evening, Lena stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the air cool against her skin, the lights below blinking like distant stars. She heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her, felt the familiar warmth of Ethan's presence, his arms sliding gently around her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder. For a long moment they stood like that, wrapped in silence, hearts beating in sync, neither of them needing to speak. When Ethan finally did, his voice was low, rough with emotion. "Do you ever think," he murmured, "about how easily we could have missed each other?" Lena closed her eyes, her hand covering his where it rested on her waist. "Every day," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "I think about the night they sold me, about how terrified I was, about how you could have sent me away, how you could have turned your back, and I wouldn't have blamed you, but you didn't." Ethan exhaled softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You saved me too, you know," he murmured. "I was drowning in all of it, in the anger, the guilt, the grief, and then you walked into my life, and suddenly I wanted to fight for something more than revenge. I wanted to fight for you." Lena turned slowly in his arms, her hands resting lightly on his chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered. "I don't know if we'll ever be free of all this, if they'll come back, if your sister will stop running, if my family will ever be safe. But I do know this. I want to stand beside you. Whatever happens, I want to fight for this. For us." Ethan's eyes softened, his hands cradling her face. "You're not the girl they tried to break," he said quietly. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. You faced the worst of this world and you didn't shatter. You're here, standing in front of me, and you're everything I never knew I needed." Lena let out a soft, shaky laugh, tears spilling over. "You're everything I was too scared to hope for," she whispered, and when Ethan leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, aching kiss, she felt the world fall away, leaving only the two of them, two broken souls healing together, piece by piece, breath by breath. In the weeks that followed, they began to rebuild, slowly, carefully. They worked with law enforcement to continue dismantling the network. They reached out to survivors, set up foundations, poured their time and money into creating safe spaces for girls like Lena. And through it all, they leaned on each other, growing stronger, braver, softer. One night, as they stood together on the balcony, Lena leaned into Ethan's side, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand clasped tightly in his. "I used to think love was something I wasn't meant for," she murmured, "something too big, too distant. But you showed me it's not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about staying, about choosing each other over and over, no matter how hard it gets." Ethan pressed a kiss to her hair, his voice soft. "I choose you," he whispered. "Every day, every hour, every breath." Lena smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks, and for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. She felt home, and she knew, no matter what storms waited beyond the horizon, they would face them together, hand in hand, heart to heart, because love, real love, wasn't about saving someone or being saved. It was about standing beside each other, fierce and unbreakable, through every darkness, until the light returned.